There are moments in modern warfare when technology planning and doctrine collide with the unpredictable reality of combat. Even in an age defined by precision-guided munitions, satellite surveillance, and near-total situational awareness, war still produces moments of raw uncertainty. One such moment unfolded in early April 2026, when a United States Air Force strike mission over Iran turned into a high-stakes survival ordeal, one that would test not only the endurance of a single pilot, but the operational reach and strategic discipline of the entire U.S. military apparatus. On April 3rd, under conditions that have not been fully disclosed but can be reasonably inferred from known operational patterns, an American F-15E Strike Eagle was conducting a mission deep inside Iranian airspace. The aircraft, designed for long-range interdiction and precision strike missions, is among the most capable platforms in the U.S. arsenal, combining speed, payload capacity, and advanced avionics. It is typically deployed in environments where air superiority is either assured or aggressively contested. On this day, however, the balance of control tilted, if only briefly, toward the defenders. Iran's integrated air defense network, built over decades, with a combination of domestic innovation and imported systems, has steadily evolved into a layered and adaptive shield. While it does not match the technological sophistication of U.S. systems in a direct comparison, it compensates through redundancy, geographic familiarity, and increasingly sophisticated radar coverage. In such an environment, even a highly capable aircraft like the F-15E is not invulnerable. At some point during the mission, the aircraft was engaged and struck by Iranian air defense systems. Whether the missile was guided by radar or infrared tracking remains unclear, but the result was decisive. The jet was critically damaged, forcing the crew to eject. Ejection is often described in technical manuals as a controlled emergency procedure. In reality, it is a violent and disorienting event. Within fractions of a second, the canopy is blown off, explosive charges fire, and the pilots are propelled out of the aircraft at tremendous force. Survival depends on timing, altitude, and a degree of luck that no training can fully guarantee. 2 aircrew members separated from their aircraft and descended into hostile territory. One of them was recovered relatively quickly. Search and rescue protocols, carefully rehearsed and supported by aerial assets, allowed U.S. forces to locate and extract him within hours. This outcome, while impressive, was not unprecedented. The United States military has spent decades refining its personnel recovery doctrine, ensuring that isolated personnel can be retrieved even under adverse conditions. The second pilot, however, was not so fortunate. A senior officer reportedly holding the rank of colonel, he landed in a far more precarious location, deep within Iranian territory, surrounded by mountainous terrain and hostile forces. Almost immediately, he became what military planners refer to as an isolated personnel case, a service member cut off from friendly forces, operating alone and at constant risk of capture. From that moment forward, the situation shifted from a routine recovery mission to a complex, multi-layered crisis. Unlike the first pilot, whose position was rapidly confirmed and secured, the second officer faced a far more dangerous reality. Communication had to be minimized. Any sustained transmission could be detected, triangulated, and exploited by Iranian forces. His survival depended on mobility, concealment, and the ability to navigate terrain under extreme stress. The geography itself offered both refuge and danger. The mountainous regions of Iran provide natural cover with steep elevations, narrow passes, and limited visibility. For a trained survivalist, such terrain can be used to evade detection. At the same time, it imposes physical strain, especially on an individual who has just undergone the trauma of ejection and may be injured. Reports indicate that the pilot moved toward higher ground, reaching elevations above 2,000 meters. This decision reflects a well-established principle in evasion tactics. High ground can provide better observation, fewer civilian encounters, and more defensible positions. However, it also exposes the individual to harsh environmental conditions. Cold temperatures, reduced oxygen levels, and limited access to water. Meanwhile, Iranian forces began their search. From their perspective, the downing of an American aircraft inside national territory represented both a tactical victory and a strategic opportunity. Capturing a US pilot alive would carry enormous propaganda value and could significantly escalate tensions between United States and Iran. As a result, search operations were likely intensified, with local units combing the area and intelligence assets attempting to intercept any signals. Time in such scenarios becomes the most critical variable. The longer an isolated pilot remains in hostile territory, the greater the risk of detection injury or exhaustion. Standard survival equipment, water signaling devices, possibly a sidearm, can only sustain an individual for a limited period. Psychological pressure compounds the physical strain, as every movement must be calculated, and every sound could signal danger. Back in Washington, the situation triggered an immediate response. The United States maintains a global capability for personnel recovery supported by elite units such as SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force. These units are trained specifically for high-risk missions, including hostage rescue and deep penetration operations in denied territory. Deploying them into Iran, however, was not a decision taken lightly. Unlike operations conducted in conflict zones where the US has an established presence, this mission required insertion into a sovereign nation with which it does not have open military engagement. The political and strategic implications were immense. Any miscalculation could trigger a broader confrontation, potentially escalating into a regional or even global crisis. Despite these risks, the calculus was clear: leaving a senior officer behind was not an option. What followed would become one of the most intense 48-hour periods in recent military operations, a race against time, terrain, and an increasingly alert adversary. As the isolated pilot continued his silent struggle for survival, American planners began assembling a response that combined deception, speed, and overwhelming precision. Intelligence agencies worked to obscure the true status of the situation, while military units prepared for rapid deployment. The stage was set for a mission that would push the boundaries of modern warfare, not through large-scale conflict, but through the careful orchestration of a single objective: bring one man home. And in the shadows of the mountains, with enemy forces closing in, that objective hung by a thread. In modern military doctrine, few missions are as complex or as politically sensitive as a deep recovery operation inside hostile territory. What began as a localized survival scenario had now evolved into a strategic crisis, requiring coordination across multiple branches of the US government. The objective was deceptively simple: extract one isolated pilot. The reality, however, demanded a level of precision and restraint that only the most elite units could deliver. Within hours of confirming that the second pilot remained alive but unaccounted for, decision-makers in Washington initiated a tightly controlled response. At the center of this effort was a doctrine known as personnel recovery, a framework that integrates intelligence, special operations, air support, and psychological operations into a single cohesive mission. It is not merely about retrieval, it is about doing so without triggering escalation. The operational challenge was immediate and profound. Unlike previous recovery missions conducted in conflict zones such as Iraq or Afghanistan, this mission would unfold inside Iran, a sovereign state with a robust security apparatus and a history of adversarial relations with the United States. There would be no margin for error, no visible footprint, and no second attempt if the first failed. The first step was intelligence consolidation. Satellite imagery signals, intelligence, and aerial reconnaissance were rapidly focused on the region where the pilot was believed to be operating. However, the pilot himself posed a paradox. While communication was necessary for coordination, it also risked exposing his position. To mitigate this, contact was kept brief, intermittent, and highly encrypted. Every transmission was measured against the risk of detection. Simultaneously, a parallel effort unfolded within the intelligence community. Analysts worked to predict Iranian search patterns, identify likely patrol routes, and determine how local forces would respond over time. This predictive modeling was essential. In a scenario where the adversary holds geographic advantage, anticipation becomes a force multiplier, but intelligence alone would not be enough. To create the necessary operational space, the United States employed a classic but highly refined tactic: strategic deception. Through controlled leaks, and indirect messaging narratives began to circulate, suggesting that the downed pilot had already been recovered. The goal was not to convince entirely, but to introduce uncertainty, to dilute the urgency of the search effort and redirect attention away from the actual area of operations. This form of information warfare, often associated with the work of agencies like Central Intelligence Agency, reflects a broader understanding of modern conflict. Control of perception can be as decisive as control of territory. By shaping the adversary's expectations, planners aim to buy time, perhaps the most valuable resource in the mission. Meanwhile, the operational force was taking shape. Elements from SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force were placed on high alert. These units represent the pinnacle of U.S. Special Operations capability, trained for missions that demand stealth speed and absolute precision. Their involvement signaled the seriousness of the situation and the willingness to act decisively. Supporting them was a network of air assets, including stealth aircraft surveillance platforms and rotary wing transport, capable of low-altitude terrain following flight. While specific platforms were not publicly disclosed, missions of this nature often rely on aircraft, such as the MH-47 Chinook or similar variants, modified for long-range infiltration and extraction under cover of darkness. The timing of the operation would be critical. Night offered concealment, but also introduced navigational challenges, particularly in mountainous terrain. Pilots would need to fly at low altitude to avoid radar detection, using terrain masking techniques that demand exceptional skill. Any deviation, any unexpected radar signature, or visual contact could compromise the entire mission. On the ground, the isolated pilot continued his evasion. By this stage, he had likely been moving for over 24 hours, navigating a hostile environment with limited supplies and no guarantee of rescue. His training would have emphasized unpredictability, avoid patterns, change direction frequently, and prioritize concealment over speed. Every decision carried weight. A wrong turn could lead into a patrol zone. A moment of rest could become a moment of capture. What makes such scenarios particularly difficult is the absence of control. Unlike conventional operations, where commanders can direct movements in real time, an isolated individual must operate independently, guided only by prior training and minimal communication. The pilot was in effect a lone variable in a vast and dynamic equation. As the 48-hour window narrowed, the urgency intensified. Military planners understand that the probability of successful recovery decreases over time. Fatigue sets in. Injuries worsen. The search radius expands. For the pilot's survival was a race against both the environment and the enemy. For the rescue force, it was a race against diminishing opportunity. Finally, a viable window emerged. Intelligence indicated a temporary gap in Iranian search coverage, an opening narrow enough to exploit, but wide enough to attempt insertion. The decision was made. The operation would proceed. Under the cover of darkness, aircraft carrying Special Operations Forces crossed into Iranian airspace. Flying low and fast, they navigated through mountainous terrain, relying on a combination of onboard systems and pilot expertise to remain undetected. Every second in hostile airspace increased the risk, but also brought them closer to their objective. On approach, communication with the pilot was re-established. Coordinates were confirmed, timing synchronized. The margin for error was measured in seconds. What followed would be the most dangerous phase of the mission, the extraction itself. Special Operations Forces would need to secure the landing zone, locate the pilot, and depart before enemy forces could converge. There would be no prolonged engagement, no fallback position. Speed and surprise were the only advantages. And yet, even with meticulous planning, no operation unfolds exactly as intended. As the helicopters descended into the rugged terrain, unforeseen complications began to emerge, mechanical, environmental, or both. In operations of this scale, even minor disruptions can cascade into critical failures. What happened next would force commanders to make a decision that few are ever prepared for: sacrifice valuable assets in order to ensure the success of the mission. The line between success and disaster had never been thinner. By the time the operation entered its final phase, the margin for success had narrowed to a razor's edge. Every variable terrain timing, enemy movement, and mechanical reliability was now compressed into a single decisive moment. The insertion had succeeded, but as any experienced planner understands, insertion is only half the mission. Extraction is where operations are won or lost. On the ground, the Special Operations Team moved with speed and discipline. Their objective was clear: secure the landing zone, locate the isolated pilot, and depart before Iranian forces could react. There was no room for prolonged engagement. The doctrine guiding such missions emphasizes brevity and precision: arrive unseen, act decisively, and disappear before the adversary can respond. The pilot, after nearly 48 hours of evasion, was finally located. He was alive, though, reportedly exhausted and possibly injured. His survival up to that point was a testament not only to his training, but also to the effectiveness of U.S. survival evasion resistance and escape protocols. These programs are designed to prepare personnel for exactly this kind of scenario, operating alone under pressure and with minimal support in hostile territory. But just as the mission approached its most critical milestone, an unexpected complication threatened to undo everything. Two of the aircraft involved in the extraction encountered severe operational issues upon landing. Whether due to unstable terrain, mechanical malfunction, or environmental conditions such as soft ground or shifting sand, they became immobilized. In a hostile environment, a grounded aircraft is more than an inconvenience. It is a liability of the highest order. Each aircraft represents not only a significant financial investment, but also a concentration of sensitive technology. Avionics systems, communication equipment, and mission-specific modifications could not be allowed to fall into the hands of Iran. The risk was not merely tactical, it was strategic. At this moment, the mission entered a phase that military professionals often describe as irreversible decision space. Commanders on the ground, in coordination with higher authority, made a critical choice: the disabled aircraft would be destroyed. This decision reflects a long-standing principle in military operations: denial of technology to the adversary. It is a principle that has shaped countless actions throughout history, from scuttling ships to demolishing equipment under retreat. In this case, it meant sacrificing multi-million-dollar assets to protect long-term strategic advantage. Explosive charges were placed. Sensitive systems were either removed or rendered inoperable. Within minutes, the aircraft were engulfed in flames, burning not as a sign of defeat, but as a deliberate act of control. Time, however, was rapidly running out. The destruction of the aircraft, while necessary, increased the urgency of the extraction. The visual signature alone, fire and smoke rising from the terrain, risked alerting nearby Iranian units. The operation, which had relied on stealth and deception, was now racing against the possibility of exposure. Backup aircraft were already en route. These contingency measures are a hallmark of elite operations. No plan is considered complete without redundancy. The arrival of secondary extraction platforms ensured that the mission could continue even under degraded conditions. Still, every additional minute on the ground increased the risk exponentially. The team regrouped. The rescued pilot was secured. Perimeter defenses were maintained with absolute discipline. No unnecessary engagement, no deviation from the extraction timeline. Then at last the remaining aircraft lifted off. Flying low through the mountainous terrain, they retraced a path out of hostile airspace. The same techniques used during insertion, terrain masking, radio silence, and precise navigation, were now employed in reverse. Behind them, the burning wreckage of the destroyed aircraft marked the cost of the mission. Ahead of them lay the uncertain boundary between danger and safety. Eventually they crossed it. The pilot was out of Iran. Against the odds, and within a window of less than 48 hours, the United States had executed one of the most complex and sensitive recovery operations in recent memory. Remarkably, no American personnel were lost during the mission, a fact that underscores the level of planning, training, and discipline involved. From a strategic perspective, the operation offers several important insights. First, it reaffirms the United States' unwavering commitment to personnel recovery. The principle that no service member is left behind is not merely symbolic, it is operationally enforced, even under the most challenging conditions. This commitment carries significant implications for morale cohesion and the broader credibility of military leadership. Second, the mission highlights the evolving nature of modern warfare. This was not a large-scale battle involving divisions or fleets. It was a highly targeted, intelligence-driven operation conducted in the shadows. Success depended not on overwhelming force, but on coordination, deception, and speed. Third, it underscores the persistent risks of operating in contested environments. Even with advanced aircraft like the F-15E Strike Eagle, no system is immune to failure or enemy action. Air superiority, often taken for granted, must be constantly maintained and defended. Finally, the destruction of the aircraft serves as a reminder that in warfare, success often involves difficult trade-offs. Material losses can be accepted, sometimes even required, to preserve strategic advantage and protect human life. In the end, this was more than a rescue mission. It was a demonstration of capability, resolve, and the complex calculus that defines modern military operations. A single pilot, isolated in hostile territory, became the focal point of a global response, one that blended intelligence, special operations, and strategic restraint into a cohesive whole. And perhaps most importantly, it was a story of survival, a story that reminds us that behind every aircraft, every mission, and every headline, there are individuals trained, committed, and operating at the limits of human endurance. If you found this breakdown insightful and want to explore more in-depth analysis of military strategy, real-world operations, and the hidden dynamics behind global conflicts, consider supporting the channel. Share this video with others who are interested in defense and geopolitics, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Strategy Scope for more content that goes beyond the headlines and into the logic that shapes the world.